Hello and welcome to today's web conference. You've joined us for Dynamics 365 Fast Track Tech Talk. Today's topic is data migration. Presenting with us today from Microsoft, we have Goncalo Antunes, who is a Senior Fast Track Program Manager. Now it's my pleasure to hand you over. Goncalo, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Debbie, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. My name is Goncalo Antunes. I'm a Fast Track Program Manager with the Dynamics 365 team, or the Fast Track for Dynamics 365 team, actually. I'm based out of Lisbon, Portugal, but working globally as part of a larger team that delivers Fast Track engagements to our customers across the globe. I'll be delivering today, like Debbie presented, a data migration tech talk. So it is a part of our portfolio of services and content within the Fast Track team to deliver such a content. And naturally, as a follow-up to a tech talk, you may take advantage of our data migration workshop, which is more practical, more hands-on, and definitely our Fast Track program managers, or the one working with you, will be gladly delivering and working with you directly in that data migration endeavor. In this case today, we're really focusing on, let's say, a first approach and starting from a higher level, an overview of data migration and what it's all about in the scope of Dynamics 365. And then narrowing down or zooming a little bit into some of the recommended practices. And then with that, I'll just actually move ahead to the objective slide and the agenda that we're covering today. And feel free as we go to drop any questions you may have in the chat window. They're going to be landing in my screen as well. And I'm going to read out those loud and answer to you during the call, if they're really in line with the content that we're speaking at that moment, or if they're not so relevant for that moment, I'll keep them to the end of the session, where we're going to spend a little bit of time in Q&A. So with no further delays in terms of data migration, we were going to cover, like I mentioned, a little bit of overview, then on number 2 and number 3, so starting a little bit into more detail, touching the different data sources and transformation and loading actions you will be performing, how to optimize that process, what are the common challenges and constraints you may find while migrating to Dynamics 365 online, and in sharing just in the last part of the session today, some of the recommended practices and learnings from the field and actual engagements we've been dealing with in the past year and a half, and naturally in the past as well, but specifically the past year and a half within the Fast Track team, that we're happy to share, and naturally happy to discuss with you any of your scenarios that you may be handling at the moment. The outcome is really about the ins and outs of how to address, how to go and target an efficient process for that data migration, and make sure we call out the known constraints and common challenges to make sure that you have enhanced the good practices and tips and tricks to achieve that successful migration. That's the goal for today. I'll just go ahead and quickly start. So in terms of data migration overview, or in terms of trying to answer the question, why do we need to migrate, actually, right? So in many cases, people just migrate to a new system and they don't really care about old data, so they just start over and start from scratch. But in I would say not 100%, because there are exceptions naturally, but in most of the cases, you do have to bring along in some way or shape or form data with you along to that other system that you're migrating to. If you're independently, if you're coming from other CRM systems, or even from Microsoft Dynamics CRM on premises, it's very common to bring data to this new online instance that you're deploying now, and for that, there are a few things that we would like you to consider, or we would like to call out for you to consider in that process. One of the common scenarios that customers usually bring to Dynamics 365 in terms of business is to have a 360 degrees view of your customer. So that's often the starting point where the discussion starts in terms of, so which data, why do I need to migrate all my data, or which pieces of my data do I need to migrate in order to really accomplish that 360 degrees view of my customer. And with that, moving to next steps or moving further in the discussion, generally people would consider or would think that all data should be in that same place or that store or application in order to be able to have that 360 degrees view of your customer, which is a fair assumption, but technically it's not really exactly always that way, because there are always ways to report or to query or to search data out of external systems and actually make it visible within Dynamics 365. So that actually lands in that last bolded line in the slide, whereas viewing all data in Dynamics 365 is different or can be different than actually storing all the data in Dynamics 365, right? So I'm thinking already of scenarios such as integrations with backend systems, or if we're talking about banking or insurance industries, where the backend systems typically store several millions of records of customer transactions. Does it make sense to move all that data to Dynamics 365? Generally, the answer is no, it doesn't. So just with that, you have an answer for the first question, or the second one in terms of, should I store all my data in Dynamics 365, right? And then naturally, considerations or things to think about or to consider when you're actually really starting the migration or designing the migration path for your Dynamics 365 implementation. It is definitely a key moment or a key task that you can perform, which is to design a process that is actually, in many cases, cleaning up what we usually call old data or rubbish, and sometimes data that has been stored and accumulated in the older systems in such a way that somebody would just love to get rid of it because it contains so many records that are not really that needed to the business, and you would really love to start over and do some cleansing there. So that actually pulls in bullet number 1 there in terms of showing exactly what sort of things you would be able to clean up from that system of yours, from the sources actually, and just before you move it to Dynamics 365 Online. The other one next to that or along with that would be data transformation. So you probably would like to map or transform or change in some way the some of the fields or data or actual real tables that you've got in on-premises systems or in other systems before you actually move them to Dynamics 365 Online. As an example, the simple example, your customer may be called a customer in your old system, let's call it that way, and a few fields may be named in a certain way, but when you're moving that to Dynamics 365 Online, perhaps you want to call your customer an account, and some of the fields may be called in a different way and may actually be consolidating some data from multiple fields into one. So that's definitely one of the tasks or things that you can do in detail in terms of transforming your data before you actually migrate it to Dynamics 365 Online. The next one would be in terms of real migration time. Let's say that you're considering to do the move over a weekend, so you shut down your old system on Friday evening, and you do all the data migration during that weekend, and you're assuming that on Monday morning everything is on, and you can move all the users to Dynamics 365 Online, and it's all there. There's nothing missing, and they can just start the work to work on the system on Monday morning without any trouble, right? So that's what we usually call a one-time migration or one shot you just shut down the old system, migrate everything, and then turn on the new system, and all the users are in. But perhaps you can't really do that because data sets are so large that you can't really accomplish to do that over a weekend, or you actually don't want to, and you prefer to move old data first, let's say from until December last year, and then which historically is data that is not going to be touched any longer, but you want to move that first, and then on that migration weekend, then you're going to do what we usually call the deltas. So it's only the differential between that data until December 31st and the data that users have been playing with until today or until that day of the migration. And you're going to move only that small piece of data, and that actually is achievable within a couple of hours, and you're good to go live on Monday morning. So that's things to consider and things to recall whenever you're dealing with such a migration. It might be a very common sense question or topic, but it definitely makes a difference when you're actually migrating the data or planning to do your migration, and then considering how to do it. And that touches the two next items in terms of data volume and storage. So like I mentioned, the amount of data that you choose to migrate, and how many records, what's the size of each record, and how much it's going to consume in that destination system in Dynamics 365 Online will determine how long it's going to take you to migrate, and how much it's going to cost you in the end when you're finally done with the move, and that will be your starting point for your Dynamics 365 instance in online. And naturally, there are costs associated with that storage consumption that you need to consider and think about when moving or progressing with your system, with your production system as you go further. And naturally then as well, scalability, so scale, growth. So if you're growing 1 million records, 1 million contacts a year, or if you're growing with that 2 million opportunities per quarter, that sort of exercise and measurement within your scalability is to be considered, and that will actually help you with the decision of whether or not you should migrate all the data that you've got in the source system, or perhaps just from data from last year, or data that's been there for a certain amount of time. So it's really everything comes into play when you're throwing these questions to the table with your team and determining exactly what you need to migrate and how. And lastly, but also very, very important, compliance and regulations, right? So naturally, our infrastructure complies with a lot of, or most of the well-known regulations and compliance frameworks, but it's never soon to actually go and make sure that you're compliant and that the data that you're moving, if it falls into one of those compliance frameworks, if we're covering it, I certainly hope we are. If we're not, please reach out and ask for clarification with your program manager, and we'll make sure that we have that situation addressed, and that you can actually upload or migrate the data that you need to be migrated if there are pieces that you can't afford to migrate due to some sort of additional compliance or regulations, then it is on the table as well how to deal with that. So perhaps there are certain pieces or certain fields that can't really be migrated, but perhaps you can create a reference to it so that it actually maps something within a backend on-premises system of yours or some other external system that complies with your regulations. So with that said, I'm just going to start a little bit deeper into data sources, data transformation, and loading activities. Just to call out that naturally data will be brought from different sources and different formats, different ways of dealing with that, of querying, fetching data from different systems, and things naturally that need to come into play really have to do about establishing or having a very well-defined data dictionary and data model that will help you determining the mapping and how you're going to migrate that data accordingly. So find rules to consolidate those pieces of data from the different sources, leverage import and staging databases for those activities that I mentioned earlier as well, in terms of extracting, transforming, loading, and cleansing as well. And really define at this stage what you really need to migrate versus what you just need to see or visualize within Dynamics 365. This is really a crucial moment that will help you determine how to move forward in a sustainable way with the rest of the migration. Sometimes it's really a trade-off between effort and the value that you're going to take out of that data that you choose to migrate. So it's really up to not only from the technical perspective, but up to the business to determine or to help you determine exactly which pieces of data you're going to migrate to Dynamics 365 Online. So cleansing and transforming, that's what I mentioned earlier. Several sub-activities, let's call it that way, or tasks included in that generally have to do with deduplicating data. So like I mentioned earlier, it's very common to have in older systems or in old systems prior to this new one that you're migrating to, data that you would like to get rid of or clean up, or just that you won't use and you would like to remove and consider or mark as considering old data. And also with that, check for missing required fields and null references or missing references, and really make a way to properly resolve and define the uniqueness of records and make sure that you're not really duplicating data in the destination system again and falling into the same mistake of not having in place proper rules to control how your data will be stored and growing throughout the future. So ensure proper mapping is established as well when you're transforming your data. So formatting, ranging. So in terms of migrating some number fields from source might need some formatting or actually some range checks before you actually store them in the destination fields, along with some calculations and some conversion that you may need to do along with the other tasks. The last one there is also important or interesting, which is enriching. So it's very common for people to take this advantage of migrating data, or at this stage to have an actual staging database as an example, in a virtual machine where you're handling all these different data sets from different multiple sources in that staging database before you actually migrate it to online, and also enrich those data sets. So say bringing additional extra data that was not stored anywhere, was not even considered within the system, and that you now have the chance to bring it in and bring it in along with the data that you were already planning to migrate. So it's really also a good moment to consider that. And last but not least, if introducing already some recommendations, do as much as you can in terms of data cleansing and transforming before you actually send the data to Dynamics 365. So make sure you transform, you do all sorts of transformation, data manipulation as much as you can before you throw them or you send it to Dynamics 365. Because if you send it to Dynamics 365, processing will have to be done in a certain way. So if it's through web services directly storing in certain fields, and naturally, I'm not saying that it takes too long, but it is processing time that will be added on to your data migration task. Or if it's actually triggering some other activities that will have to be done asynchronously through workflows or additional plugins, that will also require additional time. So, and it's within online, and in a certain way you don't have the same access to it as you do in your staging database. So it's definitely recommended for you to take or to do as much as you can, let's call it that way, quote unquote, before you actually send the data. So make that data adapt and kind of directly map to the fields that you're storing into that Dynamics 365 table or entity when you're moving it to the cloud. Just moving along, so I've mentioned this one already in terms of loading deltas, or in terms of that example of migrating in a big bulk of data, let's say data from year 2000 until year 2017, 31st of December, let's call it that way. That's quite a large date interval, but let's say that you're considering moving all the data from a few years back until 31st of December 2017 in that initial data migration window. And then when you do define when you're going to cut over the old system, let's say a Friday evening, then you're going to migrate all the deltas, or the delta, that's all the data that has been changed, created, or actually even deleted from the 31st of December or 1st of January until today, or until the day of that cutover. That's what we usually call an iteration or a delta. But naturally, you can do that over and over again. Some customers actually run this in different ways, and they prefer to do it in different bulks and migrate data in pieces until they actually have that last iteration, which will be done in that last weekend of let's call it the go live weekend or migration weekend, where everybody's gonna switch from Friday evening old system to Monday morning Dynamics 365 online as the new system in place. In terms of really loading data, so when you're actually through the design phase and you're through with the setting up your environment and your tooling, and I haven't mentioned tooling yet, but naturally it's on purpose actually. We're not really targeting or influencing or recommending a specific tool to migrate your data. Some customers have been doing it with third-party applications. Some others build their own SDK-based data migration tooling or code. Some others have been using the regular Web API or the modern Web API actually, and with fairly good results, I must say. Fairly good performance there. And we're not recommending one in particular. We do mention and recommend to use or to leverage certain pieces of the technology that I'm going to mention further on in the session, but there's no one solution fits all for everybody. So in terms of migrating your data and things that you would consider, and we definitely recommend you to take into consideration, have to do with considering the data that you're migrating, but in the sense of consider the parent record or parent entity records plus child entity records and all the configuration data behind. So as an example, you may have rules and dependencies of some configuration stored in certain entities that you would need to migrate accounts, as an example, right? And then when you're migrating accounts, you actually need to migrate accounts first, and then you actually have several contacts that are linked to these accounts, and you need to determine and make sure that you're preparing the migration order for those different data sets in order to make sure that you achieve the desired outcome of your migration. Typically, you would preload any configuration data. You would create parent records first, and then migrate children after with the parent record preset already. Similar to owner and statuses of records. So setting the owner on migration time or presetting already, or there are naturally some records that you can establish already the status when you're migrating it. Some others that you can't do that actually, and you just migrate it as active, and then let's say set it as closed or set it as whatever other status you've got in that record. So establish that order and logical order of tasks within the migration of each of the entities, and make use of multiple threads to do that. So scaling out is recommended so that you don't just concentrate the migration of data into one single process or one single thread that may not perform as expected, and you're migrating a few records an hour or a minute, and then you were expecting to migrate several hundreds of thousands or even thousands of records per hour. Reach out to your Fast Track program manager for assistance there. We do have several guiding lines and assistance that we can provide directly to your case, and we'll make sure that we help you and allow you to migrate your data in a faster way than you were initially expecting. So moving to the optimization of the process. So until now we were just talking about, or roughly around, the designing, the things to consider, where do I start from, and what things should I consider, and what other possibilities I've got. But now we will be in this section. The next section will be more on so when you're on it, how do you actually optimize that process? So say you've got the system or your tooling, your process well designed, your different sources, your staging area, and then Dynamics 365. Then it's the time to seek for improvements. So improvement areas. So try to understand if you've got a bottleneck here somewhere, determine a small subset of data, migrate that subset and measure the times, and try to understand where you're being stalled. If there's a kind of a bottleneck in between that you can target and improve, and make sure that you can optimize that and make sure that all the data will be imported or migrated in the best possible way. Then coming back to that other topic on migrating in one time or in multiple times, If you're considering delta, so migrating multiple times, so one big shot and then other multiple times or one additional time to migrate data, you may consider leveraging conditional splits in the sense of, say, the system picks up, or your tooling to migrate data picks up the next record in the queue, and it will have to send it to CRM. So will it, sorry, I keep saying CRM, it's Dynamics 365 Online. It will have to determine, okay, will it just create the record? Is it the first time that I'm importing this data? Yes. Okay, then it's a no-brainer. I'll just go ahead and create. So this is the right hand of the screen. So this path here that I marked in yellow. Or if it's another way, which is, oh no, actually I've ran this migration before, so this is my second or n time that I'm migrating. So I'll go this way, and how do I determine if this is an actual new record or if this is gonna go and actually just update a record instead, right? So if you leverage your tooling to or your code to typically would run this with timestamps and other ways, but this would help you a lot in terms of establishing what sort of message or call you would be doing to the system in order to migrate that record. So if it's a create record call, or if it's an update record call, or what is it, right? If you can get to this level of detail and establish such a system, then you will be even more under control of how much it's going to perform, how good it's going to perform, and then how much more can you actually optimize it further on as you go through this process. Along with that, and I mentioned it before as well, use multi-threading. So leverage multi-threading, pick or spin up multiple processes or threads sending data to Dynamics 365. Perhaps they're all consuming the same source staging area. Perhaps some of them are, as an example, migrating accounts. Some others are migrating contacts. It's really up to you, but make sure you leverage that, and as well make use of what we call the execute multiple requests. So execute multiple is a batch, the best way to define it is take a create request. So you take one record, you package or you create that create message, and then you send it to Dynamics 365. So that's one single request. But you can actually take hundreds or 200, let's say, as an example, create requests, batch them together into an execute multiple requests, and send that one call with one execute multiple requests, which actually in detail contains, in this example, 200 create record requests, sent in one shot to the platform in Dynamics 365. This generally is much, much better in terms of performance. You can play with the batch size as well, so as low as 1 or 2, which is kind of roughly very close to single request, up to 1,000 as a batch size. So that's the current platform limit that we've set, which is to have a batch of up to 1,000. Now, if I would recommend 1,000, certainly not, or generally not. Typically, we've seen and lesson learned from different projects there. Typically, you would play with that batch size depending on the complexity. So complexity means if your entity has, let's say, a lot of complexity, a lot of lookup fields, weather entities, plenty of columns, so that kind of creates a large size for each record and even complexity behind it, because resolving all the lookups will take a while. So larger complexity, less batch size, let's call it that way, or smaller batch size. That's the way to say it. or less complexity, you can actually increase the batch size and make it perform differently. Generally, we've seen, and this is not a rule, but just we've seen based on experience, customers playing with batch sizes between 200 and 500 records per execute multiple, or sorry, not records, requests per execute multiple. Per batch, and then play with that a little bit depending on the complexity of the entity. So let me just move ahead and explore different approaches. I mentioned it a little ago. There's no one size fits all, or one approach, one system fits all, or one tool fits all. It's really about exploring and the different approaches and think about all the different things we've talked about here today, and discuss all the other existing with any other existing with your Fast Track Program Manager, and then determine exactly which one goes along with your needs in order to make sure that you can accomplish that best data migration design and process for the project of yours. I'll just go ahead and start a little deeper into sharing a little bit the common challenges and constraints we've seen in the projects we've been handling within Fast Track. So common challenges really have been around performance and throughput, let's say. So it's taking too long, or it's too slow. That's the kind of thing we hear about. Data volume and migration window, so work and improve, starting from or reduce from months of expected time to migrate to weeks, or even to days, or even hours, to be able to migrate your data. Think about or challenges as well have been raised around impersonation of data. So I don't want to migrate all my data as if I were the service account, or all records after they migrated, they are all owned by the service account that migrated all the data. So you may consider and think about impersonation, and make sure that you're actually migrating data as is, or actually assigning it to the real user that owns the data. And also, lastly, but very important as well, the migration of some special field or special data, if you want to call it that way, and then especially when you're migrating from on-premises to online, where you may have some tables that are not migratable directly as you would be expecting. I always think about the audit table, that it's not migratable in the way that you would like it to be. So with that, I'll just go ahead and some examples. Kind of, if I had to map the migration to Dynamics 365 bullets or items as the good, the bad, and the ugly, definitely good, and we've mentioned that already, is the usage of parallelism, so multiple threads, execute multiple, the batching that I mentioned before, staging as of the staging area, where you're consolidating all that data from the multiple sources, doing cleansing, transforming data, enriching data, just before you actually move it to Dynamics 365. The bad would be there are definitely few things that you can't really migrate the way that you would expect. So you can't migrate system jobs, you can't migrate directly as data team membership. So what you can do is then process and associate records of users to teams afterwards, but it's not really a table or a migration of data as like you're migrating contacts. Or audit table, which is actually data, but in the way we've got it today, it's not migratable in the same way, because it is audit, and there are many other things along with audit that you would need to discuss with your compliance teams to kind of decide and determine why is audit not migratable in the same way. There are certain ways and manners to deal with this, but naturally it is something that is called kind of a bad thing in that sense that you can't really migrate in the bad way, in the good way. The ugly in the sense that you can migrate, but there's kind of another way or a few things to consider, alternative methods to achieve that, and I'm going to share that a little bit further on, just with typically to do with migration of special fields, and let's call it that way, quote unquote, that I'm going to mention to you just in a minute. And then performance and throughput. Again, you may have a fast car that really performs really well, but it's only a 1-seat or 2-seat car, which is fine in many cases. But if you're throwing millions of let's call it people or thousands of people across the country, then perhaps one fast car is not enough, and you would rather have multiple slow cars with many more people in each of the cars just going through the highway and have more throughput with it, right? So this is kind of comparing and contrasting the approach that I mentioned earlier of single requests of calls to Dynamics 365 or multiple requests in the sense of doing an execute multiple with a batch size of 200 records, and on top of that even leverage multiple threads. So with that, you kind of have a big highway of data being thrown, and then with a high throughput to the system, as opposite to having a fast single request, single thread process doing this migration. So it's really something to think about and to consider and to understand what will be the differences there between one and the other. And then just introducing a little bit already the recommended practices on the web API. I mentioned it earlier before already. Several customers have used third-party tools with very good results. Some others have been developing their own code within the SDK, picking up data from sources or staging areas, building up the multiple threads and execute multiple requests, and communicating with CRM, with Dynamics 365 Online through the general SDK calls. But also, as you might have heard, hopefully you did, we've been empowering and promoting more the web API, which generally allows you to do all sorts of operations with the platform, and as well a migration of data, and even completing the additional tasks, to, as an example, create related records or even associate users to teams, as an example, like I mentioned before. So Web API is really a rich, RESTful API that really allows you to do a lot, and you can also leverage, and should actually leverage multiple threading with the Web API. We've seen and have many customers following this approach in terms of development capabilities. Our flexibility is also very powerful, but definitely in terms of data throughput and performance of that migration process, we've achieved very good results in using this approach. So definitely consider it and let us know, or let your program manager know about it, and this will be certainly helpful to achieve your data migration in the best suitable time. And then the impersonation that I mentioned earlier. So one of the things that you can do, not only data migration, this slide brings the topic about data migration, but also data integration, right? So you may have further on, even after you've migrated your data, the chance or the need to have integration between systems, and instead of having a one user account which represents a person that is kind of locked as a licensed user in the system, that is consuming the license. There's a username and password in it, and there's a lot of things to manage. Just to run that integration, or again the migration itself, you could leverage what we call the application user. So search on our documentation. There are links here. When you've got the presentation, you'll be able to click on them and access them. But if you look them up on your search bar, you will get these references and this information about how to set up an application user in let's say in Azure, Azure Active Directory, and then how to add it to Dynamics 365 as an application user, and which role will it have, and then make use of it to perform that migration, or even to be the one running that integration job that you have in the system afterwards. Okay, so this is really about impersonating and bringing service accounts, let's call it that way, into a totally different approach. And then handling special fields. So I mentioned a little bit before as well, inactive users or activity parties, as an example. Those are challenges. So you can't really just migrate users or migrate data to inactive users in that sense, but there is a kind of a tricky way to do that, and I'll mention that to you. But if you look up for stub users approach, that's one of the things. Basically, we import inactive users to Dynamics 365 directly through, as if it was Excel, as an Excel sheet, as you would import any data through the data importer. And then those users will be assigned a specific standard role. I'll mention that to you later on. And some other things to consider have to do, as an example, the created on field. So that's something you can't really map directly. So you can't really take one record from source, take the created on field, and map it to the created on field in Dynamics 365, because it won't map directly. It will have to map the overridden created on field instead, and that one will then prevail and be updated in the system as such. So if the system sees that the overridden created on field is populated, then it will take that on as the original created on field value for that record. In terms of GUIDs, so those 32-digit or 32 characters, hexadecimal characters that you may want to migrate, that you do consider, and they're always in each record in Dynamics, that you may want to prefer to keep those. In the sense that if you map that field, it will prevail when it's created in the destination. Or if you're really unsure, or if you kind of suspect there was a lot of things being done in the on-premise database that you're really unsure, you don't want to play too much with GUIDs, you prefer not to. We're really talking here about fringes of performance. Really in the last little thing that you were considering to improve, or we're talking here about really micro or milliseconds of improvements between mapping on. So mapping means keeping the original GUIDs or generating new ones into the system. So it's really up to you, but prefer to maintain if there's no other reason why you shouldn't, and if you're really working on and improving the fringes of performance into this process of yours. Then some other ones to mention or to consider, the created by. Again, how do I create records as if I were user A, B, or C, right? That's to do with the launching the requests and making usage of caller ID and create on behalf of. So these are SDK parameters and things you should look at if you want to really migrate all the data as if it was created by the original creator in the original system and not just a service account. State codes I mentioned earlier already. There are specific ones that can actually be migrated as they are. Some others, they just need to be updated or changed afterwards after they migrated. So you may consider migrating a certain record type as open, and then immediately or afterwards run a plugin or a workflow to close it or to mark it as inactive, as an example. And then there are a few, or at least a couple of fields, modified by and modified on, that we can't really, at the moment, support to migrate. Our recommendation is really to create it if you need that, if you need those fields, if you need data in those fields from the original system, go and create a couple of custom fields next to those and migrate data from the source of those fields to these new custom fields you've created. So with that, you're kind of keeping this historical data of those fields, but you're not really migrating it to the real ones in Dynamics 365 because that is currently not supported yet. And then special entities. If we're kind of zooming out from fields to entities, when we're migrating from on-premises to online, as an example, if you got multiple orders or revision numbers of the same order, be aware that you would need to work and import them in sequence. So meaning first import revision 1 of order ID A, and then revision 2 of order ID A, so that it actually prevails, it stays in the same way in Dynamics 365 Online after everything is migrated. Otherwise, data will be in, but the sequence or the revision number will not be in the same way as you have it in the source. And then personal views. So these are kind of in the interns of the platform. They're called user queries, and you can leverage the migration of these with the help of the caller ID of the SDK that I mentioned earlier. To migrate all the data accordingly. So basically you pick all the user query records from as if you were user A, and then you migrate them, and then you pick all from user B and you migrate them, and then you're leveraging the different caller IDs through that tooling, and they will be created accordingly in the destination system. Just be aware about if your views of your user queries contain specific GUIDs in them. So in the fetch XML structure, if they contain GUIDs, make sure that you're transforming or mapping those to the new ones. Otherwise, in the destination system, they may not resolve or they will not resolve. So that's important to know as well. And then stub users, like I mentioned. So if we're talking about migrating, let's say for historical purposes, 2,000 users that have left the company already, or they will not be active anymore in online, but you still want to migrate them because some of the data mentions them or references to them. So you can create those records through the SDK, or you can use the import action from the UI directly. And those users, once they're created and or imported, they will be immediately and no other way around assigned the salesperson out-of-the-box role. So this is fixed. This is not really changeable. So if you need to later on have a certain inactive user to be holding a certain record that generally the salesperson role or user owning a salesperson role would not be able to accommodate, then the general recommendation is that you give high privileges to that salesperson role in the beginning of the migration, keep it during the migration, and then when you're done, you can actually pull it down or just inactivate that salesperson role so that nobody takes it on for the next usage of that role. And then finally, and before the last section, actually, before we wrap for Q&A, is our own general recommended practices. And this is to do with general, in different sections, actually in different categories. Pardon. Generally, when you're migrating your data, we do recommend you to disable duplicate detection in the destination system, disable workflows and plugins, auditing, activity feeds, and review the roll-up fields, calculation times. There are schedules there that you can tweak and you can postpone for later on. So this is really a kind of recommended practice. I mean, if you can't afford to have this, if you don't want to, if you for some reason still have to keep it, just keep it naturally. But just bear in mind that it will one way or the other affect a little bit your performance, or a little bit more your performance, and you would have to consider it later on. Perhaps it's okay, right? If you're not migrating that much data and you're okay with the time that it will take you, then it's okay to keep all this because it's just flowing and performing as an okay time frame. And you're good with that. But if you're really touching every single piece of your process and optimizing it all, then definitely these are first things to go to, I would say, in order to improve performance overall. If you've got any questions in the meantime, please feel free to drop them. I didn't mention it again, but feel free to do so. We'll stop for Q&A in the end anyway, but if you want to start dropping questions, just do it and I'll take them as it makes sense. On the platform side, I mentioned earlier already when we were talking about the design of the system. Generally, we've been recommending and talking with customers to leverage infrastructure as a service. So IaaS, so for staging and tooling. So say you've got an Azure virtual machine or an Azure service that you're running there, and generally in the same location or region, or Microsoft data center, let's call it that way, to do that migration job. So the closest, the better. And if it's same region, same data center, let's say North Europe or West Europe, make sure you do that in that way. So you will be reducing network latency times or delays to the bare minimum. And naturally, and very, very, again, in the fringes of improving performance, when running those integration services or integration jobs, set the account regional settings, so the service account running that job, set its regional settings to UTC. So basically, this will improve a little bit the date and time conversions. So these will be a little bit faster because the service account running it and launching that request to do conversion will be already in UTC, and then it's not much, but a little bit faster. Like I said, we're talking here about fringes of microseconds or milliseconds that they may not make a difference if you're migrating just a few hundreds or thousands of records, but if we're migrating millions of records, then it may make a difference in the end of the day or in the end of the weekend. In terms of SDK and tooling, I mentioned it a little bit already. Use parallelism and threading, so either go multiple threads or single thread, but if you're single thread, make sure you execute multiple so that you can actually launch multiple requests. Fine-tune the batch size, like I mentioned earlier. If you're using execute multiple, find that sweet spot depending on the complexity of the entity. So you may go up or down depending on that. I would say, if you want to take note, between 200 to 500 is generally a good number, playing a little bit with that slider up and down depending on the complexity. But generally, more than that, or if you go up to our limit of 1,000, there's no real gain about it, and generally it does not perform that much better. It's actually sometimes the opposite. Leverage upsert only when necessary. What does it mean? So upsert is actually, so if you recall earlier in the presentation, I had a conditional split determining, is this a new record or is this an existing record? Should I create it or should I update it? So if I don't want to care about that, or if I can take on and actually just do one call and don't care about that, I'll just call upsert, right? So if I call upsert with that record, it will send the record across to the platform. With the upsert message, it will check if the record does not exist, it will be created. If it exists, it will be updating the existing one. And that comes along with alternate keys as well. So, but that naturally it comes with a cost. So cost in the sense of time cost. Platform will have to resolve that for you. And generally it performs pretty well. But again, if we're talking about millions and millions of records, maybe you want to have that logic done before you send it to Dynamics 365. So you have that control and you know exactly what's going to happen and what sort of requests you're going to do to the system. And when it hits the system, it will go directly to the create or the update action instead of resolving the upsert conditional definition, let's say, and then determine if it's going to create or update the record instead. Again, make use of the new or newest, not too new, but they've been here for a while, but new messages of SDK to update records. So you can update the record with the owner field change, or with the state or status field change, and instead of using the assign or set state specific messages. So you can actually send that updated record, which has new fields updated and also a change of the owner and change of the statuses in one shot in an update call, instead of updating the record and then assigning to a different user and then setting the state. So those are 3 actions. You can do it all in one shot with the update call. And last but not least, again, common sense, but very, very common to fail on it. Update only the columns that you need. So there's no need to send all the columns if you're not using them, or if they're null, or null in the sense that there's no value on them, because null is also a value and it may make sense in your context. But make sure that you only include meaningful columns in that migration. Not only when you're creating, but also when you're updating. Make sure that you only you reduce the number of columns only to the ones that you actually need to accomplish that migration of that record. Okay, let me just move to the next slide. And giving you a simple example or scenario that we would definitely recommend you to do at an earlier stage after you've defined your setup. So generally, running a test case is very helpful and very useful, in the sense that it will allow you to measure and estimate and play a little bit with the different approaches. So typically create, let's say, a sample or a sample data set of a couple of, 10, 20,000 records of different entities with different conditions, or let's say really a sample of each flavor, and then do that test. So do single-threaded record calls, so leverage multiple thread processes, 10, 20, hundreds, give it a shot, there's no limit there. or prefer execute multiple, so use batches of records. Again, launch a low number of, say, 2 concurrent execute multiple threads, and then see how it goes. Play with the batch size. Or if you've played with that, it's fully optimized, but you're not achieving the best numbers yet, reach out to your fast track program manager to see what alternatives we've got there to increase that power and make sure that you can perform in terms of migrating your data with execute multiple requests. And well, this is just as for your information, an example of the usage of the alternate keys and upsert requests. I mentioned it earlier already, that this is the kind of resolution that the platform will have to do, or if you want to do that instead of the platform, on behalf of the platform, and launch the specific create or update requests instead. And that's definitely something to learn about and to consider. And lastly, what we mention as runtime limitations. So I mentioned earlier already, there's a batch size set to 1,000 as the maximum allowed, and that can be changed by you. So you can play with batches of 10, 20, 100, 500, but you can't go over 1,000. You can't. And actually, and we don't even recommend you to do so. And then the execute multiple requests that I mentioned before, there is a limit. So if you're launching concurrent ones, so multiple threads or processes to the same instance, there's a limit of 2 per organization, per instance. Work with your fast track program manager to seek for alternatives of improving this number or increasing this limit temporarily for the data migration time frame, and see what alternatives you've got there. I'm sure that we'll get to a better situation where you can actually migrate your data accordingly and within the expected time frame. And then within .NET, really down low where code is accountable, make overlap the general .NET framework. So generally, third-party tools generally already bring this included or embedded in their configuration. But if not, if you're writing your own code within the SDK, overlap those. So .NET framework in the operating system has much lower limits than as of for maximum connections per process. So make sure you increase that to say 100 or 200 maximum connections per server, so that your application, your process runs smoothly and can actually perform many more concurrent connections to Dynamics 365. And then as well, I'll just let you read through. I won't list them all, but many other additional .NET configurations and settings and options that you can explicitly set on your code to make sure that it performs well in the very end. And then if you're unsure, or if you want to understand exactly, if you're really throwing multiple records, multiple let's say threads or processes to migrating your data, because you don't know, because you can't really tell, why don't you just launch a web debugger such as Fiddler or something else and have a picture like this? So with this, you can clearly see there are, in this case, up to 20, or in this case 20 concurrent, so paralleled threads running data import to Dynamics 365, and they're all being launched and executing at the same time. So in this case, clearly the platform limits were being overridden. So this was naturally as part of our fast track projects and the engagement we've had with this customer. And this was just a fact or a real evidence that they were able to migrate data in parallel. They were actually using batches of I believe up to 500 records or 500 requests per batch in each of the calls, and they were leveraging up to 20 concurrent threads, 20 concurrent execute multiple requests to the organization, which ended up with a very, very good result, a very good throughput that allowed them to migrate several millions of records in a shorter time frame than expected. And then that would be it, really. From my side, for today, we did have this data migration tech talk that I mentioned to you about. Our intention and objective was really to bring to you not only an overview and recommendation on what to consider when designing your data migration process, but also share with you the different challenges and the different recommended practices we would like you to consider when doing this data migration task in this project of yours while migrating to Dynamics 365 Online. I don't have any other topic for today. I will open for questions, or Debbie, if you can please confirm if there are any questions in the chat window. If not, I will definitely hand it over to you. But Debbie, can you confirm that, please?
Great. Thanks, Goncalo. And at the moment, we don't have any questions, but I would like to call the audience's attention to the survey link that I posted in the messages window. Your feedback is very valuable to us. Please take a moment to fill it out prior to logging out. Click the link. You'll be taken into the survey. Enter your email address. And then once you're in there, our voting scale is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best score possible. Be sure to click on the submit button at the bottom to ensure that your feedback has been received. And with that, we don't have any questions from the audience. So do you have any final words there before we conclude our recording?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. Definitely. Just would like to thank everyone for attending. Please feel free to, please do actually provide your feedback about this session and keep coming with recommendations and ideas for other sessions you would like to see from our team. There's a good portfolio already being planned for the next couple of months. Make sure that you can make it, or if it's meaningful for you and your organization, that you can attend in real time, or if not, later on as a recording. And reach out to your Fast Track program manager for further assistance. With that said, no further delays. I would just like to wish you a very pleasant day, and thank you so much for attending. Thank you, everyone.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our web conference. The recording will be available at the same registration site within 24 hours. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Goncalo, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.